So we're looking at Jacques Derrida today, and his work. We're going to focus on his work on Plato's Pharmacy. It's from a book called Dissemination. We've talked about deconstruction a few times here already, but I wanted to look at a specific work and the way it engages with the themes that we've talked about thus far. Let me say a little bit about Derrida himself. Derrida is part of the French critical establishment, literary establishment, insofar as he worked at major institutions in France. So he was at the Sorbonne, and what's I got here in my notes? Have I even got it in my notes? The École Normale Supérieure, there for a few years, and then he was at the for 20 years, and then he was the director of higher education and social studies. He was a lecturer at Yale and Johns Hopkins for decades as well. So he's part of the establishment in that sense. But everything that he did, in many ways, could be seen as an anti-establishment stance. And so I talked about last time, or maybe it was two times before, the way in which the binary set up by the structuralists was undermined from within by the post-structuralists, and you can probably throw Derrida under the post-structuralists. And I said at the center of that binary opposition, so there's, in one sense, there's nothing that holds the project together. It's not, or at least according to its best-known writer, namely Derrida, it doesn't really have an agenda. It doesn't have a series of doctrines that it promotes. But what it does promote, and I talked about this in some senses, so in accordance with the binary, there is a being or non-being or nothingness. This, to me, seems not like the others. When you if you ever watched Sesame Street, they always had these things. Which one of these is not like the others? And you had to decide before the song was done. And there you go. This one is not like the others. It's not like male and female, but it's put alongside of it as if it were. Because if you look at it in terms of just simply philosophically, if something does not exist, it's not on par or even parallel to something that does exist. So a 1 is not like a 0. It's not. It's simply another number. It's no number, and that's not the same thing or anything like it. So it's not like it's a 2 and a 1. It's a 1 and a nothing. And as I say, binary code is written in accordance with this. So it's not like 0 does no work. It's extraordinarily powerful in certain senses, but it's not a binary opposition on par with male and female, or white and black, or however you want to put those binary oppositions. So I think that's the case with Derrida as well, is that smuggled into the idea of a binary opposition and a deconstruction of it is actually a sort of a nihilism. A nihilism that is central to the system. So he comes out of the existentialist school of the French, and much influenced by Sartre, who writes a work called Being and Nothingness. And I do think it has its influences on this. And because of this situation, many in the academy have been very hostile to Derrida, and we read that book by R.V. Young, in which he announces his own hostility to it, not out of a personal animus towards Derrida or the French per se, but the consequences of deconstruction are fundamentally anti-logocentric, and he even writes on that very topic. And if it's anti-logocentric, it is not only, Young writes as a Christian, I think, it's not only anti-Christian, it actually is anti-intellectual. It undermines the whole rationality, which is the very premise of the Western education system. Can we know things or can we not? And so other writers have talked about deconstruction as a sort of form of the debate between the realists and the nominalists. So I recommended to you that work called Ideas Have Consequences. He argues that Western philosophy is a continued extended conversation between those two schools that were right there at the outset of the medieval institution we call the university. The debate between the two, and what the position is that the deconstructionists advance is effectively that of the nominalists. So words don't really refer to anything. There's a signa, but there's no res, to use the Augustinian terminology. There is no thing that they point to. There's no presence. They're just words, and the words are always losing. They're trying to name something, but that capacity of nailing something down always evades them. That's what Derrida does, and so I think the comparison is probably apt. And really, the structuralist view of language is probably just a variation on nominalism. So it's an old debate in a modern form. So that is broadly what Derrida does. As I say, he's an establishment figure insofar as he works at the leading institutions. But he disestablishes them from within. So you could see him as a sort of a cultural Marxist, because that was part of the agenda of the cultural Marxists, was to insinuate themselves into the institutions that were passing on the foundational features of a culture, whether it was the legal profession or the academic or the political machinery, or even in discussions of the family, so social services and so forth. Here it's within the academy, so and he is sympathetic to the Marxist movement as well. And in fact, Terry Eagleton sees deconstruction as primarily a political agenda, and I don't know what I think about that. I'm not sure if it's correct or not. It certainly comes out, it emerges in the 1960s, around the times of that revolutionary political movement, so it's possible. I'm less interested in that myself, and more interested in the philosophical and the literary aspects of it, though I'm not dismissing the importance of the political dimension. But he doesn't adopt any fixed position, Derrida. He simply reads fixed positions and then observes how they aren't as fixed as they purport to be. And so the way in which he presents it, and I find this really interesting, I thought it was topical today, he presents his methodology in terms of a metaphor, and the metaphor is that of a virus. COVID-19. It's the virus. It has no, so deconstruction has no method per se. It has no concepts of its own, but we can look at its effect. What does it do? But this is his own account. Writing is a sort of a matrix. It has two strands. One is that it is derailed communication and undecidability. Those two things. And so he says, on the one hand, this is what viruses do. They introduce disorder into communication. If you have a virus, it interrupts the regular workings of your organism. Your body is sort of derailed in its workings, and the coding is interrupted, so you can't heal yourself. On the other hand, what's really interesting is that a virus is not a living entity itself, so it's not like a bacteria, it's not a microbe. It's not alive, so you can't kill it. This is the problem with viruses. There's no cure for a virus. It's not alive, it's also not non-living. It just is there, and it's a parasite of sorts in the sense that it lives on a living thing. So it's not alive, it's not dead. When you have these two pictures, that it derails the process of coding, and that it, in its status, it's neither living nor dead, then you have a sense of what deconstruction does. So I think it is a virus on the Western or even the educational system. since it has no agenda, it has no doctrine per se, but if its premises are accepted, it destroys the host unit, and the host unit is education. So in that sense, it's very radical indeed. Now the metaphor for this, which is really interesting, and Derrida himself talks about this, is not another metaphor besides the virus, is that of the zombie. So let me wipe out the zombie. Wipe out the virus, rather, and talk about the zombie. Now, a zombie is a fit metaphor for the very same thing, precisely for this reason. A zombie is a late arrival in Western culture. You don't read about it in the ancient world. It's probably from voodoo. African folk mythology gets brought across with the slave trade of the Caribbean and so forth. A zombie and the picture of voodoo as a sort of a terrorist religion asking for blood sacrifice and so forth is a very different entity than you find in Western literature, Western fiction, or even Western religion, because a zombie is not like a witch, because a witch is a living person, right? It's not even a demonic figure in some sense. It has this characteristic: it's neither alive nor is it dead. It's both, and it's both alive and it's dead. It's a body without a soul. It's a body without a mind. It's a body without a will. It's a body without the capacity to speak. And you can't kill it. You can't kill a zombie because the zombie's already dead. So it's interesting in just looking at popular culture, why is there such an obsession with zombies? You know, zombie apocalypse and the living dead, and like, what's with that? It's like, why is that? And I mean, aside from the fact that it's a form of horror, that particular form of horror, why does it take on such significance? The suggestion is that it's a fit portrait of, my suggestion, a fit portrait of what's going on culturally in through deconstruction. It's introducing a virus which is creating, destroying life, and you can't kill it off because there's nothing to kill. It's a nothing. So you could say the right attitude to deconstructive theory is just to dismiss it and say it's a nonsense, and I'm going to ignore it, and I'm not going to adopt it. That would be one way to deal with deconstruction. Say it's so non-important that I will simply ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist. The problem is that the virus has spread from Wuhan, China, and is now, or Paris, France, and is now throughout institutions all over the world. So not just deconstruction, but the practices which assume the validity of deconstructive techniques. They are to be found in every department and in almost every subject. So the virus has now morphed into forms that it can't be so easily eradicated. So that's the interesting thing about that. Now, so it's somewhere in the space between life and death. Because remember, you die first and then you are raised again, but you can't kill it because it's already dead. And so, because normally when you have a problem, you resolve the problem by identifying the nature of the threat, and by then proposing an antidote to it. So if it's a living being, you can kill it. You can direct your forces against it, identify the nature of the threat, target it, and eradicate it, take it out. But a zombie isn't alive, so you can't kill it. Okay, but even if it's dead, what can you do? Can you bring it to life? No, you cannot, because it's not dead either. It's walking around. So even you could breathe new life into it. You could give it life again. That's not part of zombie literature. You can't bring them back into being what they were before. At least I don't watch zombie movies. Is it possible to bring a zombie back to life to be the person it was before? I don't think so. No, never. So this is irresolvable problem. It partakes of both binary parts at the same time, so it's unresolvable. Now that's what a zombie is, but Derrida argues that the zombie and the virus, both of them, characterize the whole problem with all thinking. It pushes us into the position where it's not just an either or. It's a bit of both and. And this is what he's going to talk about when he comes to the Plato's Pharmacy as well. And that's the problem. So if it is not either something or nothing, if it's not a 1 or a 0, and it's something in between, what is that and how do you get that? You can't. Or if it's true, false, as the dichotomy. What if it's not either? And that's the suggestion of Derrida's deconstructive method, is that all of our claims to resolve the duality here between one or the other end up failing, and it's somewhere in between. And that's true if we think of nothing as an opposite to something or being. You can't resolve it, because 1 times nothing is nothing. 1 divided by nothing is still nothing. In that sense, you can't do it. But are all those other binaries of the same character and species? I don't think so. At any rate, Derrida argues that philosophy, since Plato, has worked in accordance with this sort of duality, trying to establish what being is, whether it's Plato's forms or Parmenides' being, however you will have it. Aquinas bases his whole philosophy on being as well, right? Derrida says that the undecidability, which he notices is true of the zombie and the virus, will infect all of those systems. So it's not just that he says it's about present day philosophy and their systems. He says it characterizes the whole of the intellectual tradition, and particularly because it affects speech. So that's what we're going to get to today. It's about speech. And in this, he's going to talk about a dialogue, which you will have read here. So from Plato's Pharmacy, he's talking about one particular famous dialogue by Plato, namely the Phaedrus. Now, if you're in my C.S. Lewis class, I referred to this in that class as well. Oh, I have that sinking feeling again. Let's try this out. I have to get this fixed. Wonder if this is going to work. The Phaedrus is a dialogue between Socrates on the one hand and Phaedrus. Now, Phaedrus is a young Athenian who has been hearing a dialogue by a sophist, and it's about love, actually. And whether it's better to make love with somebody that you love or to do so with somebody that you don't love. And it's sort of an interesting and odd intro to the dialogue. And if you were in my in the C.S. Lewis course, when I talked about the abolition of man, he uses an allegory there, and it's the allegory of the chariot. And the allegory of the chariot is that there are different parts to human nature. And one is the reason. The reason is the charioteer. And reason beholds the forms and tries to drive the human person towards the good, the true, the beautiful. Reason sees that clearly. But he is limited by the beasts that he is connected to, namely the body. And there are 2 parts to that. There's a black horse and a white horse. The white horse is motivated by what Lewis calls the Tao, which is the moral law. And so the white horse is able to steer up towards the forms, and he has control over those things. But there's also a black horse, and the black horse is wild and uncontrollable in some ways. And what education consists of is training the white horse to overrule the black horse and move a person towards the sun. So to direct reason, Milton calls reason right reason. How is it made right? It's made right by the white horse. So it's not just reason. Reason itself guides us nowhere. In fact, reason that isn't aware of the importance of the moral law will simply serve our passions, the black horse. So if it'll be men without chests, they have reason as well, and they're able to use it very well, but they will rationalize the most atrocious, immoral things. It's not that their reasoning power is limited by being, say, an atheist or an immoral person. They can still rationalize. So education is in training that. Now that's also used in the Phaedrus, but that's not, and I think that that's an interesting aspect to introduce into this discussion, but Derrida's not interested in that. I think it might be interesting to introduce into this discussion, but he's only interested in the latter part of the dialogue, and that is when he discusses the various merits of rhetoric and philosophy. So the rhetoric of the sophists or the philosophy of Plato. That's the discussion here. Now Derrida's concern is with the various merits of speech and writing. So as part of a dialogue, or the binary here, so the something versus nothing, he says that the Western tradition privileges speech over writing. And he uses this as Exhibit A, this dialogue. He could have also used Plato's seventh letter, his seventh epistle, where he talks about his same concerns about writing. But Socrates, who Derrida notes, and he's not the only one who's noted this, never wrote anything. So Socrates never wrote. Plato did, but Socrates himself never wrote anything. And by the way, in the 19th century, Romantic authors noted that Jesus also never wrote anything. And that was a mark of his wisdom, just like Socrates. He spoke, he didn't want to be misquoted, misunderstood, so he had the wisdom to speak, but never to write down his thoughts. Now, whatever you think of that, it's a common observation from the 19th century onward. But he convinces Phaedrus that speech is superior to writing, and he does this by means of a myth. And the myth works something like this. Socrates says, well, do you know what would please the gods the most? And of course, Phaedrus, no, I don't. Do you? Well, here's what I've heard. And then he gives the myth. And the myth is that there was one of the ancient gods of Egypt whose name was Thoth. I don't know how it's pronounced in Egyptian, so I'll use the English. His name is Thoth. He is the one who invented numbers and calculation and geometry and astronomy. Now this is interesting. That's the quadrivium. Right? So he introduced those subjects as well as games, as well as like drafts and dice and so forth. But he also introduced writing. So he introduces the quadrivium, the arts of number, and he also introduces writing. Now, this is interesting. So if you think about what the trivium and the quadrivium are, well, maybe I should put this down. So the trivium, the seven liberal arts, grammar, dialectic or logic, and rhetoric. And then the quadrivium are arithmetic and astronomy and geometry and music. Thoth introduces, in addition to the quadrivium, writing as well. Now, writing is not like the others. It's very different than the others. The quadrivium, or rather writing, is a sort of a poison, as it were. But the god at the time was, so this is the god who introduces writing, but the great god is Thamus. And Thamus, or sometimes with an S, is called by the Greeks to be Ammon. And Thoth comes to Thamus and says, all of my inventions need to be made known to the Egyptians. And so this is an inferior god coming to the superior god and saying, here are my inventions. Will you accept the inventions? Now, if Thamus says no, then the inventions will not be accepted because he has the divine right to forbid it being disseminated. And Thamus, rather than just saying yes or no, inquires into the nature of what these various inventions are. So some of them he praises, some of them he condemns. But when he comes to writing, he's uncertain of what to do. And Thoth says to him that this branch of learning, namely writing, is the one that will make the Egyptians wiser and will improve their memories. It's a Pharmacon. For all the others. Now, this word Pharmacon, from which we get pharmacy, place where you can get medicine, right? This is a Pharmacon for two things, for memory and for wisdom. Remember, we're talking about writing here. Now, a Pharmacon is a Greek word that is roughly corresponds to a magic potion. Could be a recipe, could be a cure, it could be a remedy. But it's a very ambiguous word in Greek because it also means poison. So a pharmacy is a bit like, or Pharmacon's a little bit like the English word drug. Like a drug will cure you, but it will also drug you. So it has negative connotations as well. So it fits this idea. So Derrida, reading into Plato's dialogue, suggests that this word and the ambiguity or the senses that it can have a negative and a positive effect, he uses as an illustration to illustrate how language, even when it's trying to say something important and establish truth, has ambiguities about its terminology. And this is typical of Derrida, by the way. So he'll pick on one word or even a footnote in a famous dialogue, and that will be the central point of the discussion. It's not the central point for Derrida or for Socrates or Plato, but it is for Derrida. So it has a curative capacity. It also has a poisonous capacity, says Derrida. It's both and, just like the zombie, just like the virus. And so when Thoth offers writing as a Pharmacon, does he mean it's to be a cure? In which case, if it is, then it will help memory and it will help develop wisdom. If it's intended to be that. On the other hand, if it's the opposite, it will be terrifically damaging to both wisdom and health. And we know what Plato's own views on this are, again from his 7th letter. He argues that if things are written down, rather than aid memory, it will allow people not to know things. They'll just consult them, but they won't actually memorize it. They won't commit it to memory, so it will actually undermine memory. And as a result, it will undermine wisdom, because wisdom is something that takes time. It has to slowly settle in and digest. This is one of the problems with the internet that I repeatedly note. People say they're going to look something up, or when you ask them, do they know something, they go to their phones and just say, well, here's what the phone says. Well, that's not knowing anything. Over the years now, it doesn't happen that much because I won't allow it in the classroom. I'd ask people if they knew something, and then somebody would look at his phone and tell me what it said on the phone. I said, I didn't ask you what the phone said. I asked if you knew it. And they didn't see the difference. Genuinely. I don't know if you are like that now, but it's a common feature of almost everybody. So it's a laziness. It fosters an intellectual laziness and a reliance on the authorities then as well. So it's not very critical. The assumption is that the first thing that pops up on your screen is going to be the correct thing. But how would you know that that was correct even? Like if it's in Wikipedia, anybody can amend the Wikipedia entry. You require no qualifications. So how would you know if it was even true, let alone whether it had been biased by somebody in the field? So you could write my biographical entry on Wikipedia, you put all manner of stuff in there, true and false. Eventually it probably gets corrected, but by me, if I ever went to look at it, if I ever had an entry, I would say, hold on a second here, that's just not true. I didn't say or do that, and this is an unflattering way of looking at whatever. But the point is, anybody who didn't know otherwise would say, oh, let me look him up. There you go, right? So there it is. So it not only does not aid memory, it allows people not to know or memorize or remember anything, and this, as in the sense it's a part of their knowledge base, but it also fosters the opposite of wisdom. It creates a sort of a folly. So that's the negative case, but it's being presented by Thoth as an aid to the two. Thamus is quite wise, and he says that the person who discovers an art is not a good person to judge whether it's harmful or helpful. So just because, so you're the inventor, of course you think it's a good thing because you invented it. But it's not for you to decide whether it is a good thing or not. So I think in some ways this is really interesting. The scientist who develops new technologies, new ways of doing things, often, and you'll note this, I've taught the sci-fi sub-creation course and various other courses, Lewis's fiction now, will discover new things, and then they'll consider the ethical implications after the fact, whether it's Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, what have you. It's only after the experiment is done that the goodness or the evil of the act is considered. So that, in its sense, is interesting to me as well. So it's not actually the scientists who should determine whether something is worthy of doing in science. It's probably others. I would say that it's a philosophical consideration, it's a religious consideration, it's a political consideration. Modern science tends to advance by saying that it needs freedom to investigate and inquire, but it doesn't actually do so with an ethical framework. It probably needs to do that. I shouldn't say probably, it does need to do that. So the abolition of man that Lewis talked about, in which the Tao has been dismissed, needs to be brought back into education for education to actually advance for the benefit of humanity. But I get off topic here. But so the very wise Thamus says to Thoth, you're not going to decide whether this is a good thing or not. And in fact, what you have suggested I do is the exact opposite of what I'm going to do. Because, Thamus says, those who write will stop exercising their memory and they'll become forgetful. They'll rely on external means of knowing things rather than internalizing them. This is why I don't, by the way, I don't do tests per se. I do essay examinations because you have to know those things. I don't want you to exercise your short-term memory to regurgitate material on a page and then a day later forget about it. I think it's not knowledge. I'm not fostering knowledge by doing that. It's not just because I like the method of essay writing. It's that it's requiring different resources from you. You actually have to know something. And that capacity for knowing things is one that you hold on to. You don't need a Wikipedia page because you've got it in your memory bank. You've memorized famous texts. You've understood the contours of the debates because you've read the sources. So that's the first response he makes. And so he says, you've discovered a pharmacon for reminding, but not for memory. And that's what I think the internet is. It can remind us of something, but it's not internalized. So it's a very superficial form of knowledge, if it is knowledge at all. And as for the wisdom aspect of it, this is the second attribute. As for the wisdom, you offer your students just a appearance of wisdom, not the reality of it. And so they'll receive many things from you without proper instruction, and they'll seem to be knowledgeable while they're actually ignorant. so they can point to the text, right? But they don't understand the text. They can't explain the text. So since the internet was invented, a lot of knowledge has been put in an online form, easily accessed from anywhere at any time, which in some ways is wonderful because it's the democratization of learning. Anybody, you don't need to be wealthy, you don't need to be privileged by your location where you live in the world. None of that. You can, as long as you have the technology to access it, you can from anywhere. So this is wonderful in some ways. But what it doesn't give you is the thing that will distinguish one person from the other, namely the learning that goes with it. And that's a long, slow process. And that does require wisdom. So wisdom is something they will not have. They'll have the conceit of wisdom rather than being really wise. So isn't this an interesting dialogue in that sense? And the response of Phaedrus to this is what the Theban says sounds true. And Socrates says, it's like a portrait painting. It looks like the person, but it's a lifeless thing. It doesn't contain the substance. And it can't answer back when you ask it a question. So if you look at Plato's own dialogue, so there's an irony here. Plato's writing this in a dialogue, it's a form of writing. On the other hand, he's offering his writing in the form of the academy, and the academy works through the Socratic method. So they retain the method, they just use the teaching of the master, Plato. But the Platonic academy stays until for almost a millennium afterwards. After his death, the academy persists and uses the Socratic method of dialectic within it. But he says that if it is simply the writings, you cannot gain anything from the writing, which I would say is also in some sense true of simply of reading any text. You have to meditate on it. You have to read it, you have to mark it, and you have to inwardly digest it. And then it becomes a part of, so the word, let's take the Bible now, the word of God becomes your part of your mental framework insofar as you understand the words, but then you also think about it and reflect on it. And it becomes a transformative thing. Right? It's used by Ezekiel, where he consumes the scroll. Right? He's told to eat it. And I'm told in Jewish circles that to teach the Hebrew alphabet, that they use these wooden blocks, the little, those little cubes with the letters on them, and they cover them with honey. So the kids are tasting and knowing. So that it's the connotation between, that's very primitive in some ways, between a letter and something that's sweet. And the children are learning the alphabet through that. I didn't do this with my own children, by the way. But I think it's interesting. The child is very early introduced to the idea that the word and sweetness go together. Very literalistic in some ways, but the importance of digesting it as well. If you think about it, it becomes a part of your organism when you read something and when you meditate on it and reflect on it. So those who only have a text, but they don't actually engage with it and discuss it and reflect on it, will never know who it ought to speak to even. Because not everybody will benefit from wisdom. Only the wise will benefit from wisdom. The majority of humanity is foolish. The text can't seek those people out. They don't also come to the text. Anybody can access it. So this is my concern about the internet. It has now permitted everybody to access it. Will more wisdom result from this or less? I've seen no evidence that more will result from it. Not a bit. But this is Socrates' point. It needs its own father there to support it. So the one who authored the text needs to be there to make sure that it's not misunderstood. To say, no, when I said this, I didn't mean that, etc. So here's Derrida's comment now. Writing is by Socrates condemned. Why? Memory will decline, true education will be corrupted, false knowledge will replace true wisdom, and we will have a text which will be an orphaned entity from its author, its father, and it will be useless. It won't be able to do what its author intended it to do. But Thoth offered it as a Pharmacon. And Thamus, the authority figure, makes a decision. I'm going to resolve the ambiguity and I'm just going to reject it. So it's nothing. But Derrida says it's not nothing. It's irresolvable. It's something that lies in between that. So that's the comments about the dialogue to begin with, first of all. I mean, it's fairly clear and straightforward, right? Derrida's take on it, that, on the other hand, is a little different, and this is where it twists a bit. Plato's argument depends on some pretty clear set of oppositions. So good and evil, for one, inside and outside, the true and false and the essence. I'll continue these below. Or the non-being. Oh no, just the appearance. Yes. Superficial. And then life and death. So these sorts of oppositions, it depends on these things. And so Plato's definition of writing is inserted into these. So speech is good, writing is bad. The memory is internal, whereas writing is external. Speech is true, writing tends towards falsehood. Speech carries the essence of knowledge, writing carries the appearance of it. It's just something that you see. One conveys the life of the author's mind, the other is the dead letter, as it were. It's not adequate. In fact, it's only the appearance of it, and in that sense, it ought to be banished. And so Derrida notes that if someone got to thinking that something like the Pharmacon governed the oppositions, they'd have to bend into a strange contortion that he says wouldn't be anything like logic. It would be something different. But the Pharmacon and writing doesn't fit this exact black and white presentation that Socrates presents. So to be clear, I don't think that either Plato or Socrates would ever agree to what Plato or what Derrida is saying. I don't think he would ever agree with it. So it's a very strange form of reading the text, and it begs the question, and it almost illustrates exactly what Plato is contending in the text, is that people that are reading the text can lack understanding of it and misrepresent it. But for Derrida, writing plays across this. It is both good and evil. It's both inside and outside, true and false, and likewise speech. Speech can also be on both sides of these. It's not a black and white thing. So it's neither a cure nor a poison, the Pharmacon. It's a little bit of both. So living speech is a lot like dead writing, says Derrida. It's not quite as different. And so when he uses the metaphor of writing to describe true knowledge and internal memory, he's still using writing. Note that he observes this, the hypocrisy, as it were. So you say that writing is only going to convey falsehood and the mere appearance of knowledge, and yet you're actually writing. I would supplement that or respond to it, and I said, yes, but the writings were taught in his academy by people that followed the Socratic method through the entirety of it. So it's not just he left us the writings. He also left us the academy and the methodology used within it, right? So he left people who learned from Socrates, just like Jesus does not only leave us with the Bible, but with people who have studied the Bible and have passed on the faith that was taught to them. So it's not just God doesn't just use the Bible as if the book itself were floating around and transformed people's lives. He brought people that were transformed by it who were then able to teach it. So speaking people as well as the word. But Derrida isn't interested in that sort of binary opposition when it doesn't suit his purposes. So this is probably my critique of him here. But he says that once we realize that the logic of the Pharmacon partakes of both cure and poison, then we need to acknowledge something else. And this is what he calls the supplement. But when we notice that Pharmacon means both of those things, and that speech and writing and the evaluation that speech is infinitely superior to writing is presented in a written document, it explodes, he says, Plato's argument. And as soon as we acknowledge that, he will note that Plato's argument relies on certain dualities as well, or binary oppositions. So the difference between father and son, Egyptian and Greek, original derivation. Are we sure of these sharp distinctions? He says that the original myth that Plato presents here from Egypt, in their original form, had different names. So in the original Egyptian myth, the characters are not Thoth but Thoth and Ammon, as opposed to Thoth and Ammon. What did I say his name was? Thamus, right? And Thoth is the son of the sun god. But in the supplement, Thoth is the supplement to Ammon, according to Derrida. And the supplement in French means two things. One, it means an addition. So it's a supplemental thing. The other, it's a replacement. It doesn't mean that in English, by the way. Although the word supplant does. To supplant is to replace. In French, apparently, the word, or at least as he uses it with an accent, and again, he does this all the time, it drives me crazy. He creates words. So the word supplement in French means something. He will introduce an accent to it, which will suggest that the word means something different than the French word. So you have to learn Derrida's own specialized vocabulary in order to understand the meaning that Derrida is attributing to it in his text. Anyway, so the word supplement is both an addition to the original, in the sense that the son is an addition to the father, but also a replacement. So it is both, if it's not A, and it's A. So this is A, and this is not A. So this is the father, and this is the son. Ammon is the father, Thoth is his son. Okay, the son is not the father, they're not the same being. On the other hand, he gave rise to the son, and he's a supplement to him, he's an addition to him. On the other hand, the son will also eventually replace the father, right? Because he will take on, when the father dies, he'll take on his place. So the supplement extends and replaces, just like a dietary supplement adds to your diet and becomes a part of your diet. You can present it in different ways. To add to something means that to add to something that's already complete. So this is anyway. I'll try not to express my annoyance at Derrida, because it just seems to me to be it's sort of clever, and it's sort of interesting, and it's very creative. But is it actually engaging with the topics, or is it just off topic? I just think it's consistently off topic because of his adherence to nihilism. I'm convinced in some ways. So, in one sense, we'll look at it differently, and I'm getting this from Where did I get this from originally? There's a little summary. I think it was Derrida for Dummies. So I got pictures. I'll send you the pictures afterwards because it's quite fun. And he has a little picture of Derrida. He's got a shock of white hair on the screen, and little bubbles coming out of his face, speech bubbles and stuff like that. It's really quite, I'll send it to you. You'll like it. The supplement has this odd logic on the one hand. So to be in addition to something means you're being added to something already complete. The king was a king before he had a son. Right? So this is complete, and now it's been added to. Well, if it's been added to, what was complete wasn't complete. It was complete before, but now it is an addition to it. If it needs an addition, then it wasn't complete. So it used to be complete before the son was there at all. The king was complete, but once the son was added to the father, it suggested that something was there. Something is there now, which was lacking in the past. So we could. The son is there now. There, we could erase the son. So there was an absence, in fact. But as soon as we acknowledge that the son being an addition is an extension of the king in some way, he was lacking something before. Okay. The supplement extends by repeating. So the king's son has the same blood, the same title, the same throne, the same country, all of those things. But the supplement opposes the father by replacing him. We could put it radically in the sense of supplanting him. If he decided to overthrow his father, he would literally supplant him. But even if he was a dutiful son and he waited till his father died, he would still replace him. And at that point, we would say, as we say in English, the king is dead, long live the king. You've probably seen this in movies. Is death, is dead. Long live the king. And when the king's dying, they have the crown, they stick it on the king, or a coronet, and they have it on the king's head. And as soon as he's expired his last breath, the whatever officer of the court takes the coronet from the king's head and puts it on the son's head instantly, because the kingdom can never be without a king. And so there's always a living representative of kingship within the kingdom, so they pass it on. And so there is, in one sense, of course, the father has just passed away, but the kingship endures. There's an unbroken continuity of order and leadership in it, so recognizing that. So when they declare the king is dead, long live the king, it escapes the grip of standard logic. And it follows the logic of the supplement, says Derrida. The king is the same, but he's also different. And he must be the same but different. So there was a father king, and now there's a supplement king. These are illustrations of the same duality of the that I talked about earlier, of the virus and of the zombie. But now this is a supplement. So we don't just need truth and falsehood, we need the supplementation of it at all points. So Thoth opposes his father king, but he opposes what he himself repeats, namely his kingship. So the son opposed the father, but at the same time he replaces his father and becomes effectively his father. I have a father, now I am a father. I used to be a son, I'm still a son. But to my son, I'm not a son, I'm a father. He likewise, if he should have children, would become a father, and he'll be a supplement, and he'll carry the name, etc., all that sort of stuff. So what, in a sense, he does is he opposes himself insofar, and now this is presented in medieval political theory as the king's two bodies. Right? There's the king, whatever you want to name the king, let's say the Plantagenets. No, that's not. Why can I not think of the name? Let's think of a different royal line then. The Tudors, that's easier. The Tudors. There's Henry Tudor, Henry VIII. He happens to have not heard the king is dead, long live the king, because they had no male heir. It would be, but the king would be dead, long live the queen. It's possible in England, not possible in other countries. I think in France, not possible. So he opposed a previous king, and then he himself became the king. So what king was he opposed to? Well, he was opposed to the man and not kingship, per se. So anyway, there's an ambiguity even there in the sense of the king. There's the man who is the king, and then there's the kingship, which he represents. All of these things are simply to illustrate what Derrida is talking about consistently, which is that there is a sense in which the supplement is necessary to explain the fact that our notions of logic and binary oppositions don't really account for the complexity of reality. Even our words, when they're written, they have different connotations. So Thoth is, if you want, the other for Thamus. If there's a self and another, he's the other. And so he's his father's other. He is a father himself when he becomes a father, and he's also just himself. So he's all three of these things. He's an other to the father. He is a father, eventually himself, and he remains himself. So he's three things. And he can't, says Derrida, be assigned any one of the three. He's all of the three. All three are part of his identity. So he is a bit of a trickster figure. Or as Derrida calls it, he's a joker. He's the card that belongs to the deck, and it can trump all the other things. Which one of these cards? Well, a joker in a card deck can be any card you want. You can, when you play a joker, you can say the joker is the whatever the highest card is, right? But it's a well, you've seen jokers in cards. You play cards? Some people, okay. And the joker is the one that trumps all the others, right? But it becomes one of the cards, takes the place of it. So he's a floating signifier. He's a wild card. As Derrida says, he puts play into play. He's the inventor of games, just like the god was at the outset that invented writing. He's a trickster figure. So this is an extraordinarily clever little dialogue. Playing on, and this is characteristic of Derrida's writing. Now, some people despise him for probably obvious reasons, but other people just find his writing very creative, and he's almost like an artist rather than a thinker, playing on words and so forth. And the responses to him, they wildly diverge from R.V. Young's hatred of him, basically, saying this man is a poison to the academy, to others that say, well, there's something interesting here, and I think they must be bored with academia. Let's play with the ideas. But I think it's fair to say that what he says about Plato or Socrates would never have agreed to and dismissed altogether. There's no doubt about that to my mind. So do you have comments or questions? That was the dialogue that we read there, or at least the dissemination from Plato's or from Derrida's work, Plato's Pharmacy. But all of that is in there. I've given you sort of a summary of it. But you can see that he uses various Greek words here. There's a logos indebted, there's a tokos, which is a child, and he's using various Greek words and derivations of that and looking at the various connotations. So this is not a man who, without learning, he knows the Greek language and various connotations of Greek words and so forth in the same way that Heidegger does. So it's a highly learned way of destabilizing the learning establishment. Comments or questions? We can see he goes on with this. Plays on words. That's part of his methodology here. He'll go on in this, by the way, in this talk about fathers and sons and the original and derivative in the sense of the supplement, go on to talk about philosophy as well. So he'll say philosophy, as it exists, the Western philosophical tradition doesn't know what to do with undecidable things. It has to resolve them. It has to say they're true or they're false. It works through logic, right? binary logic. It can't be something and also not something. Those are contradictions that it has to be resolved. So Derrida then looks up some related words. Besides pharmakos, he looks at pharmakois. Where did I put it? Think about, oh, there. Which is a magician. So pharmakos, let's say a cure or a poison, where a pharmakois is a magician. What is it? Does he do white magic or does he do black magic? Socrates' opponents call him a magician. He's a pharmakois. He's working an enchantment on them, they say. We're saying one thing and you seem to twist our words back on us and get us to contradict ourselves. And I find myself, having been very secure in my position, knowing what I thought, and by the end of my dialogue, you've led me down into an aporia. This is a Greek word that is used in Plato's dialogues, which is down a dead-end street. I can't get out. He does this all the time in his dialogues. It starts with somebody who claims to know something about something, and after, in our books, a few pages of dialogue, Socrates, reduces them to a blithering mass. Like, I say, uncle, just stop. So it starts off with long speeches, and they end up, yes, Socrates, no, Socrates, whatever you say, Socrates, I want to punch you in the face, Socrates, that sort of thing. They also say that. So is the sorcery of the undecidable inside philosophy, or is it actually extrinsic to it? So if even his opponents talk about the way in which he's taken their cure and named it a poison, and this is an act of magic, is this in fact what philosophy itself does? This is just Derrida, and I think he's trying to really irk the philosophers, and the philosophers are irked, by the way. They hate Derrida. The other thing, and this is another translation for pharmakos. It's a scapegoat. A scapegoat is the suffers for the evil that's found inside a city. Think about it in Scripture. On the Day of Atonement, there are two animals. One of them is sacrificed, right? And there are certain prescriptions for the type of animal, the way you sacrifice, etc. The other has the high priest's hands laid upon it, and then it's whacked in the back and it's driven out into the wilderness. A scapegoat bears the sins of the people. So the one goat expiates the sin, or propitiates the sins, rather. That's the one that gets sacrificed. The other expiates them. It takes them away from the people. Because the one is an atonement for their sins. The other recognizes that they remain sinners, so it just removes them for a year, and then it comes back and they have to do it again in a year's time and so forth. So here the scapegoat is the evil that has to be cast out to retain the city's purity, or at least to defer the judgment upon the city. So in that sense, Orpheus, Oedipus, it becomes a scapegoat for the crimes that he himself in fact committed. In C.S. Lewis's work that we're just reading, Till We Have Faces, it's Psyche. She becomes the scapegoat for the ills that have befallen her nation. So something that is going to be a scapegoat has to partake of the city, and then it's going to be driven out. It will represent the city, so it's both there and outside of it. And so he again notes this word pharmakos related to the magician and related to the cure and the poison. So it doesn't just get fixed, it continues to be a problem. So this is what he's observing. That logic doesn't solve the problems per se. There are other considerations in the mix here. So the scapegoat has to be an insider first, and then he's going to become an outsider. It's both and. Just like Socrates himself, who's an Athenian and fought in the Athenian wars, they offered him at the end of his life whether he would rather be driven out of the city and banished into exile, or whether he would rather drink the pharmacon, the poison, hemlock. And he drank that rather than leave the city. But in a sense, he was scapegoated by the Athenians, accused of corrupting the youth, when he was actually suggesting that it was his opponents that were corrupting the youth. So he became a symbol of his opponent's hatred. And to this day, Socrates is seen as a martyr for the truth. He was accused by his opponents of falsehood. So again, there's this ambiguity. And so in this sense, I think it's quite clever and interesting. And so Derrida observes that writing is the incurable and undecidable pharmacon for philosophy. The inside-outside dynamic assures us that there's an order. It's an order within the camp. You can cast into the wilderness where there's disorder, anarchy, lawlessness, whatever. But the apparent purity and truth within the camp, Derrida is suggested, is not so pure and is not so settled. It's not so decided. It's always up for discussion. There are no settled truths, etc., etc. Anyway, that's more or less what he's doing here. I think it's interesting. Certainly clever. Derrida is certainly more worthy of reading than anyone who takes his strategy and applies it without Derrida's cleverness. So Derrida, I would say, is worth reading. Those who follow his strategies, probably not so much. So whatever order has been established within the camp, Derrida destabilizes that order. So he's an unsettling figure, and in that sense, he's a lot like Socrates himself, which was called he was called a gadfly. He saw that was his function. His function, in some sense, was unsettling people of their certitudes. Comments or questions? Right, so on page 1727, it goes on to the pharmakoios that I talked about, the magician aspect of it. So, and then on 1729, from 9, play from the Pharmacon to the letter, etc. I've got 5 minutes, so I'll read a bit of that. So it has been thought that Plato simply condemned play, and by the same token the art of mimesis, which is only a type of play. But in all questions involving play, says Derrida, and its opposite, the logic will necessarily be baffling. Play and art are lost by Plato as he saves them, and his logos is then subject to that untold constraint that can no longer even be called logic. Plato does very well speak of play. He speaks in praise of it, but he praises play, quote, in the best sense of the word, unquote, if this can be said without eliminating play beneath the reassuring silliness of such a precaution. The best sense of play is play that is supervised and contained within the safeguards of ethics and politics. This is play comprehended under the innocent, innocuous category of fun. Amusement, however far off it may be, the common translation of paideia by pastime, divertissement, no doubt only helps consolidate the Platonic repression of play. So Plato talks about the importance of play, but then he says there's only certain types of play that are playful. So he constrains it and it's no longer play at that point. This is the problem of the philosopher. The philosopher is always trying to stop people from having fun, like Derrida, and constrain intellectual inquiry and so forth. So they're trying to use their words to hold down the discipline that the writing undermines. And then they say the voices of the philosopher are preventing philosophizing. And the text, on the other hand, undermines their control over it. So again, the charge that is made by Eagleton that Derrida's real aim is an anti-establishment political agenda may be correct. So there are people in the institutions that are telling us what knowledge is and controlling that, and they're actually preventing the very thing they purport to be upholding and disseminating and inculcating. Anyway. Whatever you make of it. So it is an attack on philosophy, which irks the philosophers, needless to say. And it irks them because Plato does not follow the methodology of the philosopher. He engages with them without engaging with them, which is rather infuriating. Doesn't want to use the rules, the methodology of the academy, while at the same time being within the academy, and at the same time his teachings are destroying the academy. So says the academy. I happen to agree with the academy on this. I do think it's fundamentally destructive. I can tolerate it, quite frankly. That doesn't bother me per se. The problem is that what he's inserting into the system is a virus. And if the virus is not eradicated from the body of the academy, then the virus ends up taking over the academy, and it does actually destabilize it. So that what is presented as a playful engagement is in fact probably a surd element. Now, you know what a surd element is in mathematics? Oh, look it up. An element of illogic into a whole system of logic. If you introduce this in mathematics, a surd element, and accept it, then you're admitting that within the system that a logic can partake of the whole logical system, in which case the whole thing unravels. The surd element probably is a zero, in a sense. But Derrida's writing is not a zero, it is actually a body of writing. It's just advocating for, in a sense, nothing. The plausibility of nothingness or of non-being. So I do think my best take on it, and I'm still not sure about this, is that it is a form of nihilism. It's much ado about nothing. Anyways, well, if you don't have any comments or questions, I'll just leave it off at that.